5 years. $2 million. 17 specialists flown in from 3 continents. And Evelyn's Ferrari still sat in the garage like an unsolvable equation, cold, silent, untouched by all of it. No one could explain why that legendary engine refused to start. Not one spark, not one sound, not a single breath of life from beneath that hood since the day she inherited it. Until the afternoon when Evelyn finally ran out of patience, turned across the garage floor toward the man holding a mop in the corner and said, "What about you? Do you dare even try?" No one in that room knew what was coming. Follow right now. The story behind this Ferrari is something you will not believe until you hear it for yourself. Meridian Motorworks occupied the ground floor of a converted industrial building on the west side of Los Angeles, and it was nothing like the grimy repair shops most people pictured when they heard the word garage. The floors were polished to a mirror finish. The lighting was precise and cool. The air carried the faint mingled scent of leather and premium machine oil, and every vehicle inside was treated less like property and more like a museum exhibit. Clients paid for that atmosphere as much as they paid for the work. It was the kind of place where people brought things they could not afford to lose. And it was where Evelyn came every Monday morning without fail, not to manage anything or instruct anyone, but simply to stand beside a car she had been unable to start for 5 years and feel whatever it was she felt in those minutes before she turned around and went back to the rest of her life. Evelyn was 41 years old. She ran Holloway & Crane, one of the most respected architectural design firms on the West Coast, and in every professional context she inhabited, she was the person who moved first, spoke clearest, and left a room knowing more than she had when she entered. She was not a woman who allowed problems to outlast her attention. She was precise in her language, deliberate in her decisions, and disciplined in the way she held the line between what she felt and what she chose to show. These qualities had built everything she had. Except for one thing they had not been able to touch at all. The Ferrari 250 GTO had belonged to her father. It was a 1963 model, one of fewer than 40 examples still confirmed to exist in the world, and its body was finished in Rosso Corsa, a red so deep and particular it seemed to shift color depending on where the light touched it. The chrome along the vents had dulled slightly over the decades, and the leather inside had taken on the specific softness of something that had been handled and loved for a very long time before being left to wait. Her father had died 5 years earlier and the car had come to her through his estate, arriving at Meridian on a flatbed in late autumn, and from that first day it had never once started. She did not love cars. She had never been interested in racing or engineering or the mechanics of anything that ran on fuel. But this car was different, and the reason was simple and irreducible. It was the last thing on earth that still connected her to the man who had raised her. Her father had been a private person in the way that certain men of his generation were private, not cold, not absent, but contained, someone who expressed care through presence and action rather than declaration. He had mentioned the Ferrari only rarely, and when he did it was always briefly, and the few things he had said about it stayed with her precisely because they were so few. He had told her once that it had been with him a long time. He had told her once that it mattered to him in a way he could not fully explain. She had not pushed. She had thought, as children always do, that there would be time. There was not. Now the car sat in bay number 4 at Meridian, and every Monday morning she stood beside it for a few minutes without knowing what she was waiting for, only that she was not ready to stop. What she wanted, if she allowed herself to be entirely honest, was to hear the engine, just once. Her father had described that sound once briefly, in passing, as the thing that made him feel most in the world. She wanted to know what he had meant. She wanted to be in the room when it happened. That Monday in late October she stood beside the car longer than usual, her hand resting on the roof, the metal cold beneath her palm. Then she turned and walked out into the pale morning light and left the Ferrari exactly as it always was, perfect, silent, and completely unreachable. The file on the Ferrari was thick enough to be mistaken for a legal brief. Evelyn had read every page of it so many times she could recall specific passages without opening it. The chain of failed interventions had begun within weeks of the car's arrival, when Cameron, Meridian's senior technician, ran the first diagnostic. Cameron was 47, broad-shouldered, and wore his 2 decades of experience with European vintage vehicles the way certain men wear expensive watches, visibly and often. He had worked on Maseratis, Alfa Romeos, and more than a dozen historic Ferraris over the course of his career, and when he first examined the 250 GTO, he had spoken with the easy confidence of someone who expected to be finished within a week. He was not finished within a week. He was not finished at all. He ran 3 complete diagnostics over the following month and produced documentation that was meticulous, professionally formatted, and entirely without conclusion. He had theories. He always had theories. None of them led anywhere. Over the 5 years that followed, Evelyn had brought in 3 Ferrari specialists from Maranello, flown directly from the manufacturer's hometown in northern Italy at a combined cost of more than $400,000 in travel, accommodation, and professional fees. 2 German engineers who had spent their careers restoring competition-era engines added $60,000 to the ledger and departed having replaced 4 components, all of which were correct to begin with. A British restoration team arrived with 7 technicians, worked for 6 weeks, replaced 15 parts, and left without making any meaningful progress. A retired American engineer who had once participated in the restoration of a 250 GT for a private museum in Geneva spent 4 days examining the car, asked for 2 more to think, and then politely declined to continue. Each expert produced documentation. Each document was thorough, technically precise, and ultimately inconclusive. The largest single expenditure had been Adrian. Evelyn had flown to Rome specifically to meet him, having been told by 2 separate sources in the restoration community that he was the only living technician to have successfully brought 3 separate examples of the 250 GTO back from non-operational states. Adrian was in his mid-50s, quiet-spoken, and genuinely distinguished in his field. He arrived at Meridian with 2 assistants and a collection of specialized instruments that required their own shipping cases. He spent 3 months on the car. At the end of 3 months, he submitted a 50-page technical report filled with observations, measurements, and cross-referenced analysis. His conclusion occupied less than a single paragraph and read, in effect, as an admission that he did not understand what he was dealing with. His fee came to $250,000. The total spent across 5 years landed just below $2 million. What made it genuinely maddening, more than the cost, more than the time, was that every single specialist had reached the same baffling conclusion. The car was in perfect condition, every component was correct, every circuit was intact, every fuel line was clean, every mechanical system checked against factory specification and held. There was nothing wrong with the Ferrari in any diagnosable sense. It simply would not start. It was as if the car had made a decision, and no amount of money or expertise could negotiate with it. Cameron's most recent theory, offered in the tone of a man more interested in protecting his professional reputation than solving the problem, was that there might be some form of residual calibration error embedded in the ignition timing. Though he acknowledged in the same breath that the concept made no physical sense for a vehicle manufactured in 1963, before the era of programmable systems. The theory existed mainly because he needed something to say. Evelyn had stopped listening to his theories 18 months ago. What stayed with her was not frustration exactly, though there was plenty of that. It was a feeling closer to the sense that everyone who had touched the car had been asking the wrong questions, that the answer was somewhere inside it, patient and unmoving, and that no one who had come and gone had been willing to be still enough to find it. Isaac had been at Meridian for 3 months when the story turned. He had been hired as a maintenance and cleaning contractor through a third-party staffing agency, and his intake paperwork listed no prior automotive industry experience. Only a general labor background and a residential address in a part of the city where people did not often land prestigious technical careers. He was 38, lean, with the kind of face that was easy to overlook because it gave so little away. He wore the gray uniform that Meridian required of its maintenance staff and moved through the garage with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that invisibility was its own form of freedom. He arrived on time, he did his work without incident, and by the end of his 3rd week no one at Meridian had had a substantive conversation with him about anything. What distinguished him, if anyone had been paying close enough attention, was his hands. They were not the hands of a man whose primary relationship with physical labor involved pushing a mop across polished floors. The calluses were in the wrong places, or rather, in very specific places, the kind that develop from years of sustained contact with precision tools. The joints of his fingers carried old marks from sustained fine work, and no matter how thoroughly he washed them, there remained at the base of his fingernails a faint trace of machine oil that had been absorbed too deeply to fully disappear. Grace, Meridian's front desk coordinator, had noticed this early on but said nothing. People carried histories that were not her business to investigate. What Grace had noticed more recently was the way Isaac behaved around the Ferrari. It was not obvious. Nothing about Isaac was obvious, but it was consistent. Whenever his cleaning circuit brought him through bay number 4, he would pause for just a moment longer than necessary, not staring, not lingering in any way that drew attention, just a brief stillness before he moved on. But the angle of his gaze was not the angle most people used when they looked at that car. He did not look at the hood the way enthusiasts did, or at the sculpted bodywork the way admirers did. He looked at the rear wheel arch, at the undercarriage from a low, oblique angle, at the junction between the frame rail and the firewall, places that only mattered to someone thinking about how a car was built rather than how it looked. 2 weeks before the afternoon everything changed, Cameron had left a technical drawing on his workbench, a detailed cross-section of a V12 engine from the early 1960s, pulled from an archive reference binder. Isaac, whose cleaning route passed the workbench, had picked it up to move it to the side. He had held it for 13 seconds before setting it down. Grace had been watching from across the room and had counted, though she could not have said why. The drawing had been upside down when he picked it up. He had turned it the right way around without thinking. The automatic correction of someone for whom that orientation was as natural as reading a sentence from left to right. Isaac had arrived in Los Angeles 6 months earlier from Turin in northern Italy. What he had been doing in Turin and what had brought him to the other side of the world to work a maintenance contract at a luxury automotive garage were questions no one at Meridian had thought to ask. His employment file contained a work authorization, a clean background check, and 2 references that checked out without issue. The staffing agency had not dug further. Cameron had not asked. Evelyn had never been introduced to him at all. In Turin, if one knew where to look, the name Isaac still circulated among a small and close-kept group of retired technical engineers who had spent their careers working on historic vehicles. It was spoken in a particular way, not loudly, not often, but with a quality of weight that attached to names people associated with something significant that had ended badly. Whether that ending had been a failure or a punishment depended entirely on who was speaking. The people who had worked alongside him described it one way. The people who had worked above him described it another. Both groups, from their different directions, agreed on one thing, that he had been exceptional. None of this was known at Meridian. Isaac cleaned floors and replaced light bulbs and emptied waste bins, and the Ferrari sat in bay number 4, and 5 years continued to become 5 years and 3 months. The afternoon it broke open was a Friday in early November. Adrian had called Evelyn at 2 o'clock on a video connection, and the conversation lasted 11 minutes. He had not called to report progress. He had called because he felt it was his professional obligation to formally communicate what he had come to believe, which was that the problem with the car existed outside the boundaries of what he understood. He did not use the word inexplicable. He was too careful and too proud for that. But the sentence he used came close enough that Evelyn felt the floor drop slightly beneath her as she heard it. She ended the call, set the phone on the workbench beside the Ferrari, and stood very still for a while. The afternoon light came in cold through the high windows and fell across the hood of the car, and the red looked darker than usual, almost brown where the shadow reached it. Cameron came in from the back office. He would have said he came to check on a parts order, but his timing was not accidental. He had known about the call, and he moved through the garage door with the practiced ease of a man who has positioned himself for a particular conversation. He stood beside Evelyn for a moment, looking at the car, and then said what he had been building toward for the better part of a year. The car had a market value, even in its current non-running state, that placed it well above $1.5 million at auction. There were collectors who would pay for provenance alone. Sometimes knowing when to let something go was the clearest demonstration of good judgment. He said this calmly, in the tone of a man offering reasonable counsel, which made it considerably worse. Evelyn did not look at him. She held her gaze on the car for another moment. Then she looked up, and across the open space of the garage she saw Isaac moving along the far wall with his mop, unhurried, making his way around the perimeter the way he always did. What happened next was not calculated. She was, in almost all circumstances, a calculated person. What happened in the following 30 seconds was none of that. It was 5 years of expertise and invoices and polite professional failures accumulating into one unguarded moment, the kind that arrives when the gap between what a person controls and what a person feels finally closes entirely. She turned to Cameron and said, 20 years, $2 million. And it's still dead. Then she pointed across the garage at Isaac. What about you? Do you know anything about cars? Do you dare even try? Are you going to take my money and disappear like everyone else? The garage went silent. Grace, who had been standing near the front desk, stopped moving. Cameron's expression went through something brief and complicated before settling into a thin smile, the kind that communicated contempt without requiring the directness of saying it aloud. Isaac set his mop against the wall. He looked at Evelyn, not with deference, not with defensiveness, but with the level attention of someone who had already decided what they were going to say before they said it. 48 hours, he said. No assistant, no upfront budget. If I fail, you owe me nothing. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then, without fully understanding why, she said yes. Isaac began at 7 o'clock that Friday evening. He asked for the garage to be cleared, not because he needed privacy, but because he needed silence. Cameron left with visible reluctance, his footsteps deliberate and slow in the manner of a man performing his exit. Grace turned off the front desk lights and let herself out the side door. Evelyn stayed in the upstairs office with the internal camera feed open on her monitor, watching without watching, the way you watch a procedure you don't fully understand but cannot bring yourself to leave. He did not touch the car for the first 20 minutes. He pulled a stool to a position several feet in front of the Ferrari and sat down. He looked at the car the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand before deciding how to approach it, not analyzing exactly, more like waiting for it to show him where to begin. Then he stood, walked slowly around the vehicle twice, and stopped at the rear left corner. He crouched down, placed his ear near the body of the car without making contact, and tapped the exterior once with one knuckle. He listened. He moved 6 inches to the right and did it again. He moved to the passenger side and repeated the process at 4 separate points along the lower body. He was not performing for the camera. He had already forgotten the camera existed. What followed over the next several hours was unlike anything Cameron's team had done in 5 years. Isaac was not following a diagnostic protocol. He moved around and under the car with the focused, unhurried attention of someone reading a document in a language they know well but have not spoken in some time. Careful, deliberate, following evidence that only he seemed able to locate. He retrieved a small notebook from the front pocket of his uniform. Not a tablet, not a device of any kind, just a plain paper notebook battered at the edges, filled with existing notation that he now added to steadily as the hours passed. By the time Saturday morning arrived and Cameron walked in through the side entrance, earlier than necessary, arriving to observe, which to say arriving to wait for a failure, Isaac had removed a small assembly from the right side of the gearbox housing and set it on a cloth on the workbench. It was a component roughly the size of a fist, unremarkable in appearance, positioned in a location that none of the previous specialists had focused on in 5 years of examination. Cameron looked at it, then looked at Isaac. "That's the torque balance linkage," he said. "If you've disturbed the load distribution on that assembly incorrectly, you risk cascading stress fractures through the drivetrain." Isaac was bent over the gearbox housing and did not look up. "I know what it is," he said. "This is exactly where I need to be." Cameron stood there for another moment, then walked to the back of the garage and made himself busy with something unrelated. Grace came in at 9 with 2 coffees. She set one beside Isaac's notebook, which was lying open on the edge of the workbench. She read, without meaning to pry, 2 lines visible on the open page. One was a sequence of measurements written in a hand so small and even it could have been typeset. The other was a single sentence in the margin, written in a mix of English and Italian in slightly different ink, as if it had been added at a separate moment. "The problem is not in the engine. The problem is that no one has asked what the car is trying to say." Grace set the coffee down. She did not mention what she had read to anyone, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. By Saturday afternoon, the quality of Isaac's movement had shifted. He had stopped exploring and started confirming. He sat for a long time in front of a specific section of the chassis near the firewall, entirely still, with the expression of someone who has worked their way through to the end of a problem and is spending a final quiet moment verifying what they already know is true. He asked to speak with Evelyn alone on Sunday morning. Grace relayed the message upstairs, and Evelyn came down at 8 o'clock wearing a dark blazer, her expression controlled in the way it always was when she was preparing for something she could not fully predict. Cameron was at the garage entrance when she arrived. She paused at the doorway and looked at him with a quality of stillness that he understood to mean he was not included in this conversation. He stayed outside. Isaac had arranged 3 objects on the workbench beside the Ferrari. The first was the small metal assembly he had removed from the gearbox housing, now cleaned and set on a separate cloth so that its structure was fully visible. The second was his open notebook, turned to a specific page. The third was a photograph. It was a black and white image, small, slightly curled at the corners, printed on the thicker paper stock of an earlier decade. Isaac had found it tucked inside the rear trunk lining, wrapped in a thin layer of oilcloth, pressed into a seam that had not been opened or examined since the last person who knew it was there had placed it. He set it in front of Evelyn without saying anything first. The photograph showed a man standing beside this Ferrari, identifiable by a specific unrepeated imperfection on the front left fender, a flaw so small it was easy to miss but exact enough to be certain, at what appeared to be a European racing circuit on a clear day. In the lower corner, written in Italian in a hand she did not recognize at first and then slowly did sempre tua. 1963, for yours always. 1963. The man in the photograph was her father. Younger than she had ever known him, younger than any image in her family's possession, standing beside that car with an expression she had never in her life seen on his face. Not pride. Something deeper and more private than pride. Something that looked, from this distance and this angle and across all those intervening decades, like a man at the exact center of his own life. Evelyn did not move for a long time. When she finally looked up, Isaac began to explain. He spoke in the manner of someone who has spent a great deal of time deciding exactly what to say and has committed to saying only what is true and nothing beyond it. The Ferrari had no mechanical fault, it had never had one. The reason it would not start was not a broken component or a missing calibration or an obscure manufacturing defect. It was an intentional mechanism, a custom-built locking system integrated into the ignition sequence and installed by hand, after the car left the factory, by a craftsman working privately and without documentation. The mechanism did not appear in any Ferrari record. It could not be detected by standard diagnostic process because it did not behave like a malfunction. It behaved like a deliberate instruction. The car would only start if you knew the exact sequence of specific physical actions required to release it, a sequence with no written record, known only to the person who built it and whoever that person had chosen to tell. Isaac pointed to a section of the small metal assembly on the cloth. "This is the trigger point," he said. "Not a lock, not a standard switch, a sequence lock. Every specialist who worked on this car spent their time examining the engine, the ignition electronics, the fuel system. No one came here because nothing here looks broken. It isn't. It was built this way intentionally by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and wanted it to stay that way." Evelyn asked the question she had been holding since he began. "How do you know this?" Isaac paused, the first pause she had seen from him in 2 full days. Something passed across his face in that pause, not quite emotion and not quite its absence, but something occupying the space between. "Because I have seen this mechanism before," he said, "once. In Turin, built by the same man. The garage was entirely quiet. Outside, Cameron had moved closer to the door. Evelyn could see from the shadow through the frosted glass panel that he had been listening. She did not address this yet. Cameron pushed the door open. He looked at Isaac with the particular flatness of a man whose professional authority has been quietly bypassed by someone he had never once considered a threat. "That is a very compelling story," he said, "but you still haven't started the car." Isaac looked at him for exactly as long as it took to let the statement stand on its own weight without adding to it. Then he turned back to Evelyn. "I need another 24 hours, he said, "and I need you to be present when I finish." Cameron made a phone call that afternoon to Adrian. He framed it as professional courtesy, informing the recently retained specialist of a new development. What it actually was, and what Cameron understood it to be at some level he preferred not to examine, was an attempt to reassemble a room of credentialed witnesses before an outcome he could neither take credit for nor dismiss. Adrian arrived the following morning without his assistants, without the instrument cases, and without the optimism of his first visit. He listened while Cameron offered a summary of Isaac's claimed discovery. His expression throughout was careful and perfectly neutral, the polished blankness of a specialist who has learned not to forecast. When Cameron finished, Adrian said nothing for a moment. Then he simply asked where Isaac was. Isaac was in the garage where he had been through the night. Grace had brought food down at 11 the previous evening. He had thanked her briefly and absently, in the way of someone whose attention was too fully occupied to disengage even for courtesy, and she had left the plate and gone back upstairs. At the doorway she had paused and looked back. He was working under a single adjustable lamp bent close over the gearbox assembly, moving with the precise and unhurried focus of a person who is not working against a deadline because they already know how the story ends. Evelyn had not slept much. She lay in the upstairs office with her phone on her chest and the ceiling above her, thinking about the photograph, about the Italian phrase, about the expression on her father's face that she had never seen anywhere in 30 years of knowing him. After midnight, she made a phone call to Gerald Whitmore, who had served as her father's attorney for nearly 3 decades, and was the last person still living who might know something about the years her father had never described. The call was short. When it was over, she put her phone down and stared at the ceiling for 15 minutes without moving. She did not go down to the garage that night, but she stood in the doorway at 2 in the morning, looking in without turning on the overhead lights. Isaac was still at the workbench. He did not look up. She left without saying anything, and later she would not be entirely certain whether he had known she was there. Isaac appeared in the doorway of Evelyn's office at 11 o'clock on Monday morning. He looked like a man who had worked for 3 days without adequate sleep and had not yet decided whether the investment had been worth it. But his eyes were entirely clear. "Are you ready?" he said. She had been ready since 2 in the morning, though she would not have used those words. They came down to the garage together. Cameron was already there, standing near the driver's side of the Ferrari with his arms crossed in the manner of a man who has prepared 2 different speeches and is waiting to determine which one the situation requires. Adrian stood near the side door, separate from the group, his expression the carefully maintained neutrality of a professional who has learned not to forecast. Grace stood near the workbench, holding nothing, watching everything. Isaac walked to the passenger side and opened the door. He stood for a moment at the threshold looking at the interior, the leather, the instruments, the steering wheel, in the way of someone crossing a threshold they have been considering for some time. Then he lowered himself into the driver's seat. What he did next was not what anyone watching expected. He did not reach for the ignition key. He placed both hands on the steering wheel first at specific positions, 10 o'clock and 7 o'clock, not the natural grip of a driver preparing to move but the deliberate placement of someone executing a sequence. He adjusted the seat position by a precise increment, moving it back until a specific alignment was achieved. He reached down and adjusted the rearview mirror without looking into it. He placed his left hand flat on the dashboard for a moment, held it there, then withdrew it. Only then did he reach for the key. He turned it. The Ferrari 250 GTO started on the first attempt. The sound that came from beneath that hood was not the labored turnover of a machine waking reluctantly from a long dormancy. It was immediate and full and total, a V12 engine finding its voice after 5 years of silence as though it had never stopped, as though it had simply been waiting for someone to ask correctly. The sound filled the garage entirely, resonating off the polished concrete floor and the high ceiling and the glass panels of the partitions, and it was exactly what Evelyn's father had once told her it would be, and she understood at once and completely what he had meant. Less like a machine, more like something alive. Evelyn took 2 steps forward before she was aware she had moved. She stopped at the driver's side window. She looked in at Isaac, who was watching the instrument panel rather than the people around him, his expression composed and unreadable. Then she did something that no one in the garage had anticipated. She knelt down so that she was at eye level with the door, placed her palm flat against the roof of the car, and closed her eyes. No one spoke. The engine ran clean and steady. Grace pressed her fingers together at her sides. Even Cameron for a moment was entirely still. Isaac turned the key back. The engine stopped. He stepped out. Cameron spoke first. His voice was controlled in the way voices are controlled when they are covering something less steady beneath. "That sequence you used," he said. "There's no record of that anywhere. Where did it come from?" Isaac said. "From the person who designed it." Cameron, and who was that? Someone who didn't want it written down. Cameron held his position for another moment, then shifted his approach to the question he had been building toward all morning. "Then let me ask you something simpler. Who exactly are you?" Isaac looked at Adrian before he answered. He held the eye contact for a measured moment. "You were the technical supervisor on the Lusso restoration in Turin in 2009, he said. "I was the lead engineer on that project." Something moved through Adrian's expression, involuntary, brief, and impossible to fully suppress. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Isaac turned to Evelyn. He spoke without hurry and without performance, in the tone of someone discharging an obligation that has been deferred too long. He had spent 14 years at Ferrari as a specialist in historic vehicle restoration and custom mechanical design. The craftsman who had built the locking mechanism in this car, the man standing beside the Ferrari in the black and white photograph, whose handwriting was in the lower corner of that image, had been Isaac's mentor. The most gifted technical mind he had encountered in 14 years of working among gifted technical minds. And in his entire career, that man had built this kind of mechanism for exactly 2 cars. What happened to the other one? Evelyn said. It was destroyed, Isaac said, in an accident, in 1971. Evelyn was very still. The attorney's phone call from the night before was sitting in her chest like a weight finding its place. She understood with the specific certainty of a piece of information arriving exactly where it was always meant to land, what the connection was. She did not say it aloud, not yet. Cameron tried one more time. If you were a Ferrari engineer, what are you doing here? He gestured at the garage, at the uniform, at everything the question implied. What brings a man with your background to a cleaning contract? The question was designed to diminish, and it did the opposite. It hung in the air of the garage like a statement about the limits of the man asking it, the loudest thing in the room and the least useful. Isaac looked at him for exactly as long as necessary. Then he turned to Evelyn. There's a question you haven't asked me yet, he said. I think you already know the answer. I'll tell you when you're ready. They sat in the small office at the back of the garage, the 2 of them, with the sound of the late morning outside and the Ferrari visible through the interior window, still and red, and finally, for the first time in 5 years, quiet in a completely different way. Not the quiet of something that could not answer, the quiet of something that had been heard. Isaac told her in the same manner in which he did everything, directly, without softening or embellishment, without asking for anything in exchange. 4 years earlier, while working on a high-profile authentication project for a European auction house that specialized in historic motorsport vehicles, he had uncovered documentation irregularities pointing to a coordinated falsification scheme. Cars were being authenticated using fabricated provenance records and sold at auction as confirmed originals. The financial scale of the fraud involved multiple 7-figure transactions over a period of at least 6 years. He had reported his findings internally first. The report was reviewed, acknowledged, and then quietly buried. He made a second approach, more formally documented. Within 30 days, his employment was terminated on grounds that were technically procedural and practically untraceable. Within 60 days, his name had been systematically removed from the technical documentation of every project he had contributed to over 14 years. Papers he had written, restorations he had led, assessments he had certified, reassigned, redacted, or simply relabeled. He did not sue. He had been advised by someone who understood how these matters resolved that the effort required would consume everything he had and produce nothing recoverable. I didn't lose my career because I was wrong, he said. I lost it because I was right. He had come to Los Angeles because he needed to be somewhere that carried no previous context around his name. The maintenance work was not a punishment and not a disguise. It was simply what was available and what required nothing he wasn't willing to give. He had not planned for the Ferrari. When he walked into Meridian on his first week and saw the car in bay number 4, he had recognized the mechanism immediately. The way you recognize the handwriting of someone who taught you to read. And he had made no plan beyond staying and waiting for the moment that announced itself. He had not approached Evelyn. He had not identified himself. He had simply done his work and remained present and let the situation develop at its own pace. I wanted to know whether the car deserved the person keeping it, he said, before I decided what to do. Evelyn listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at her hands for a moment. The engine had run. Her father's photograph was in her jacket pocket. The Italian handwriting was still sitting in her memory like something she had been trying to translate for years and had only just now understood. She thought about the attorney's call from the night before, about the year 1963, about all the years between then and a Friday afternoon when she had pointed at a man holding a mop and said, without thinking, the truest thing she had said in 5 years. Do you dare even try? You did something that $2 million couldn't do, she said quietly. Isaac's answer was immediate. You don't owe me anything. Cameron submitted his resignation the same afternoon by email, in language that was carefully professional and said nothing true. He framed it as a mutual transition, designed to suggest a choice freely made rather than a position that had become untenable. Evelyn read the email once, forwarded it to the staffing firm, and did not write back. Adrian's departure was different in kind and considerably more honest. He found Isaac in the garage in the late afternoon while Isaac was returning tools to their positions and organizing the workbench with the unhurried attention of someone who has finished a thing properly. Adrian stopped a short distance away and stood in the specific silence of a man who has something to say but is uncertain he has earned the right. Then he spoke in Italian, quietly, without audience. He had seen Isaac's name on the Turin records, had been told at the time that Isaac had departed voluntarily, had not pushed further because pushing was not his habit, and had carried a low-grade discomfort about that non-decision for 4 years without fully locating its source until this morning. He extended his hand. Isaac shook it. Nothing more was exchanged. Adrian walked out through the front entrance and did not return. Grace asked Isaac what he intended to do next. She asked it with the care of someone who hopes a particular answer without encoding that hope in the question. Isaac said he was not yet certain. For the first time in that statement, there was no weight in it. Not the answer of a man without options, but of a man standing before more of them than he had faced in several years, in no particular hurry to choose. Evelyn gave instructions that the complete technical record of the locking mechanism, every notation Isaac had made, every measurement, every step of the sequence, be archived privately in the Ferrari's file, accessible only by her direct authorization. The mechanism itself was restored to its original position in the gearbox housing, functional and intact. The photograph was returned to its place in the trunk lining, wrapped again in oilcloth, pressed into the same seam. Some things were meant to stay exactly where they were. A week later, Evelyn drove the Ferrari for the first time. Not on a highway, not anywhere that required performance or display, only through the wide, empty lot of a waterfront warehouse complex that her firm was currently designing, a vast, open concrete space temporarily free of everything. She drove it slowly, both hands on the wheel, and the engine ran beneath her exactly as it had run in the garage, full and immediate and alive. She stopped near the far edge of the lot and turned the engine off. She sat in the car for several minutes without getting out. The windshield caught the afternoon light and held it. Whatever was happening in her face during those minutes belonged only to her. Isaac was standing near the warehouse wall when she pulled back in. He had not been summoned. He had arrived in the way he arrived at most things. Quietly, without announcement, at the moment that was simply right, he watched the car decelerate and come to a stop. When Evelyn stepped out and walked toward him across the concrete, he could see from her expression that whatever she had needed to do inside that car, she had done it. She stopped a few feet away. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "There's a position I need to fill," she said eventually. "Technical Director for the Special Assets Preservation Division. It isn't an automotive role specifically, it's broader than that. The work is about ensuring that things of genuine significance don't disappear because no one was patient enough to understand them." She paused. "That's either a job description or a different kind of statement. I'm not entirely certain which." Isaac looked at her with the level attention she had come to recognize, the quality of listening that was also a quality of genuinely considering. "Are you offering or asking?" he said. "Both," she said. The space between them held, not uncomfortably. The way silence holds between two people who have stopped performing indifference and have not yet decided what comes next, but are no longer in any hurry to force the question. Isaac looked back at the Ferrari parked in the afternoon light with the Rousseau Corsa catching the last warmth of the day and returning it differently than it received it. The way certain things do when they have finally been allowed to be what they always were. Then he looked at Evelyn. And for the first time since the morning 3 months earlier when he had walked into Meridian Motorworks carrying a gray uniform and everything else he carried that no one had thought to ask about, Isaac smiled. Not a polite smile. Not a careful smile held at the correct distance. The smile of a man who has set something down after carrying it for a long time, and found in the setting down that his hands were still good.